How's everyone doing? I thought I'd fill in the silence, although Christian would say I shouldn't. There's that moment in between that silence where I shouldn't try and interpret it and shouldn't try and disrupt it, but bad habits.
Okay, so welcome. I just quickly checked that it is live. I'm assuming everybody's doing fine considering they're not responding. I hope everyone's doing okay. It's excellent to see all of you. Thank you so much for joining in and welcome. So very quickly, I'd like to introduce the concept of Epiphany Talks. So Epiphany Talks is something that came about last year when we were stuck with COVID. And we realized that the communities that we serve need knowledge to be shared as quickly as possible from different experts on different topics, what is happening with different industries. So all of the impact of COVID, that's how it started. And today marks our 25th Epiphany Talks episode. There are a range of other webinars, etc., that we put together for diverse audiences. So please go ahead and check that out. And today I am extremely, delighted to host this particular session with a professor who has been researching serendipity since it came together because of serendipity that this webinar was actually put together. So I'm going to quickly introduce Muneeb Sikander, who's the co-host, and he can talk a little bit about how this webinar came to be. Muneeb is an economist from the London School of Economics, and then we're going to introduce our lovely guest for today.
Awesome, thank you for the introduction, Samar. Yeah, I think the webinar came about. So I've been talking quite a bit with Christian, well, not quite a bit, but from time and time again since April, June, when I kind of caught the idea of serendipity. It was only an academic published journal at the time. He didn't actually launch the book yet. It was basically on how you can cultivate serendipity within incubators. So yeah, I mean, Christian's a former professor of mine, guest professor, not so I didn't kind of get to have him for a long time, but I remember doing this startup presentation in front of him, and he seemed quite happy with it. But so yeah, and I think the idea of serendipity is quite amazing if you kind of take away that magical serendipity aspect and actually look at the practicality of it. And one of those examples, I think, was when me and Samar were invited as experts to this SDPI webinar. It's a think tank, and really the discussion didn't kind of lead to anywhere much in terms of productive, actionable policy insights or actions, concrete actions to be taken. But me and Samar met through that webinar. We didn't actually physically meet. Even now, we haven't actually done that. But one of the ways that serendipity can be cultivated is you take an unexpected bad outcome, such as, oh, this talk didn't materialize into what we wanted, but then you turn it into something of an opportunity. So it's kind of how you reframe the entire idea, and that to me is kind of the best, most practical example of how serendipity was cultivated. In fact, Summer is actually one of my best friends now. So it's awesome what you can kind of do when you're not kind of when you keep that open mind and are ready to reframe yourself. So yeah, I'm absolutely delighted to have Christian with me here today, and yeah, I'll give it over to you, Summer.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, so Christian, I'm doing a very quick introduction, and then I'm going to pass the floor over or whatever, and give the mic to you, so to speak. So Dr. Christian Busch is an NYU and LSE professor and author of The Serendipity Mindset, who spent a decade exploring how unexpected moments can actually enhance our worldview, expand our social circles, and create new opportunities. Because of the onslaught of COVID, I think it has become even more important to cultivate serendipity in our everyday lives, regardless of whether we're a small startup or a business or a leader, or simply even for enriching our own personal lives. So over to you, Dr. Christian. Could you introduce yourself a little bit more and tell us what we're going to learn today?
Yeah, thank you so much, Samar and Muneeb, for the wonderful introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today. I'm a big believer that most of the knowledge usually also is in the room, so I'm also looking forward to really having a conversation, everyone sharing some of their experiences and practices as well with us. What I'd love to do is kind of take you on a short journey a journey of serendipity and trying to figure out how we can cultivate that in our lives. As Samar mentioned, this has been a huge passion of mine, and Muneeb brought us together, and serendipitously we had that interaction, and so thank you so much for bringing us together. I think Muneeb also is constantly connecting dots, so it's great to see that the spirit is here in the room. So being the German I am, I have a very kind of structured table of content for the first part, which is really around setting a bit of the context, then diving into the art and science of serendipity, these unexpected positive outcomes that define our lives, and then really talking about how do we build a muscle for that, and then really having a conversation around it. To give you a bit of context, I was this kid in high school who I was kicked out of high school. I had to repeat a year. Still have a lot of respect for my parents who kind of endured me during that period. And I transferred this into my driving style, probably held the unofficial world record of how many dustbins you can knock off on your way to school. And one day I wasn't so lucky anymore. I smashed into 4 parked cars, all cars completely destroyed, including my own. And there was this police officer who came to the scene, and he said, "Oh my God, he's still alive." And so this idea that I was supposed to be dead, like very, very deeply stuck with me. I asked myself a lot of these weird questions, who would have come to my funeral? Who would have actually cared? Was it all worth it? And, it was quite depressing to assess that at that point in time. So it put me on this intense search for meaning. And I started reading this book that I highly recommend, especially for at the moment, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is all about the question of how do we find meaning in crisis? How do we find meaning in different circumstances or in difficult circumstances? And I reread that book actually last year. I kind of had COVID early in the year with severe breathing problems and so on. And so it was one of these periods again where you just kind of like try to find some kind of meaning in all of this. And I can highly recommend that book. And when I was reading that book, what I realized is, okay, this seems to be all about trying to find like what seems to be meaningful, like what is life about, and what I realized is that what I enjoy doing the most is connecting ideas, connecting people, and connecting dots. And so kind of my last 15 years of life, or more than that now, have been about these kind of themes in different areas. I started out as a community builder. We set up a community called Sandbox Network, which identifies young people around the world who are pushing the boundaries. So young designers, artists, politicians, business people who in their fields are pushing the boundaries. And then we realized, they're usually connected in their own fields, but mindset-wise, they're much closer to people in other fields who are also pushing the boundaries. And so why don't we create a community around them and help them make ideas happen? So it's now kind of around the world. We have local communities who help people make those ideas happen. And then at some point, the inner imposter came out and said, well, we're building all these things and we're building all these social enterprises and companies and so on, but do we actually know what we're really doing? Like in terms of impact, in terms of what's really effective versus not. So that kind of led me a bit more into academia, trying to figure out what is success and failure really? How do we understand these things a bit better? We co-directed the Innovation Center at the London School of Economics, which was all about trying to understand how do we essentially take the knowledge from out there into the classroom, but also back. And now here I'm at NYU, and we're doing a lot around that question as well in terms of how do we create impact in the world. And one of the things I found fascinating on this journey of essentially bringing people together, connecting ideas and so on, was that the most joyful, purpose-driven people around me, they seem to have something in common. They intuitively see something in the unexpected. They see something in uncertainty and turn that into positive outcomes. So they cultivate serendipity all the time. And so what I got really fascinated by is the question of, hey, I've seen this work in my own life as kind of a life philosophy and a daily practice. I've seen it with all these other people, but what is it behind it? What can we learn about it that really we can take and take into everyone's lives and do exercises around it and so on. And so the book that I started, that Muneeb briefly mentioned, that I'll briefly touch on today, is really about this question of what is the science-based framework for cultivating serendipity? What's the science-based framework for turning uncertainty into opportunity? But also then what are inspiring stories and exercises we can do so that we can all grow into that kind of mindset of having more of that serendipity in our life. I mentioned, so in this book itself, you have like hundreds of stories from around the world. A lot of my work actually is in very low income contexts. So a lot of my work is in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. It's in parts of India and parts of other countries where essentially we're learning a lot from. In India in particular, for example, around Jugaad innovation, so learning from resource-constrained environments, but also then across the world, really kind of this idea that, inspiring stories, but then there seems to be something in common, and that's really what I want to focus on today, those kind of patterns that seem to happen around the world. Now, just to make sure that we're on the same page of what we talk about when we talk about serendipity, just a couple of examples. If you have erratic hand movements like I do, you tend to spill coffee. Imagine this situation, you go into a coffee shop, you spill coffee over someone, and then, you sense there might be some kind of connection there. You sense there might be something, but you don't know what it is. Now you have two options, right? Option number one is you just say, I'm so sorry, here's a napkin. You walk outside, and then you think, what could have happened had I spoken with this person, right? Option number two is you say, I'm so sorry, I was in my head. You start a conversation, and then that person turns to become the love of your life, or your co-founder, or your business partner. The point here is that the way we reacted to the unexpected defines essentially the outcome of what's happened later. This is another example at the moment in COVID times where a lot of breweries lost their main customers, which were restaurants, which went out of business. So they realized, oh, wow, okay, this is unexpected here, but maybe we can use our alcohol to produce hand sanitizer. So they pivoted into becoming hand sanitizer companies. I'll talk about TEDx Volcano in a second. I first want to ask you, can anyone guess what the thing on the top right is? You can use the chat function. What do you think is any ideas what the top right is? And thank you so much, Manur. It's wonderful to have you here and to interact with you. Samar, thank you so much also, for bringing this wonderful group together. I'm now seeing the group chat for the first time. So Xavi, also thank you for your post around the Celestine prophecy, which is also, we can dive into that later. Yeah, Samar, it looks like medicine, absolutely. Usman, yeah, you're getting very close. Medicine for male sexual problems. Siddhartha, some kind of tablets. So yes, so the truth is in the culmination of all the things you mentioned. This is essentially a couple of decades ago, a couple of researchers were giving people medication against angina, the disease, and they realized that there was some kind of movement happening in male participants' trousers. And what would we usually do? We would probably say, oh my God, that's so embarrassing. Like, why is there some movement happening in men's trousers? So we would probably either try to ignore it, or we would say, let's find a better way to cure angina that cures the side effect also of men having an erection. Now, they did the opposite. They said, you know what, that's unexpected, but a lot of men in the world might have a problem in that department. So why don't we develop a medication around this? And that's how Viagra evolved. Viagra now, exactly, Siddhartha, Viagra now being one of the most successful medications that obviously helps a lot of people have a better life. Now, on the lower right, any ideas what that could be? Any ideas? A washing machine? Thank you, Shaya. What else? Any other ideas what that could be? Chicken fryer?
Yeah, chicken fryer is what comes to mind.
Yeah, maybe that's close. So yeah, washing machine, spinner, yeah. Thawing machine.
Some sort of boiling something to boil the vegetables in, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a sweet potato washing machine. And so essentially, a couple of years ago, Haier, which is one of the largest companies in the world, they do refrigerators, washing machines, and they received calls from farmers. And the farmers told them, well, your washing machine is always breaking down. And so they asked them, why is it breaking down? Well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in it, but it just doesn't seem to work. So what would we usually do? We would probably say, well, it's a clothes washing machine. Like, it's not made for potatoes. Why would you wash them in there? Don't wash them in there. They did the opposite. They said, you know what? That's unexpected, but there's a lot of farmers in China who might have a similar problem. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? And that's how, quote unquote, coincidentally, the potato washing machine evolved. Last but not least, the TEDx example here. That's something a couple of years ago. Those of you who were in Europe at that time might remember there was this huge ash cloud that happened where a volcano broke out and all flights in London and so on got grounded because it was huge ash cloud. And I received a call on a Saturday morning from an unknown number. And, I was curious, picked it up. And it was this guy called Nathaniel. And he was like, hey, Christian, we don't know each other yet, but a mutual friend gave me your number. I just went to the Skoll World Forum, which is the largest social entrepreneurship forum in the world. And, I went there, and now I'm stuck in London. I'm originally from California. I'm stuck in London. And with me are all these attendees of the World Forum. We're all stuck in London. So I want to organize a conference. So within 32 hours, he organized a full-fledged conference with over 10,000 people watching it on the live stream, recorded live stream, speakers like Jeff Skoll and others speaking. And so one of the most successful TEDx events ever happened. And so what he did was he had that unexpected event that we all had, right? The volcano and the ash cloud. But he said, you know what? TED loves stories that are all about turning a challenge into an opportunity. So why don't I take this story and go to TED, pitch it to them? They gave him the brand, and then he started organizing, rallying the troops, and building that conference within 30 hours. Now, what all these examples have in common is that they're all about serendipity. They're all about this unexpected good luck that's happening because we proactively did something about it. It's not just something that happened to us, right? So usually when we think about luck, we think about the blind luck, right? We think about being born into a good family or having loving people around us. Like this idea of being born into a loving family, we can't choose this. This is given to us, it's passive, right? So that's the traditional luck, the blind luck. Serendipity is about smart luck. Serendipity is about the luck that we create ourselves by spotting and connecting dots, by essentially seeing some kind of trigger, right? So if you think about all the examples that we talked about, there's some kind of trigger happening, right? There's an ash cloud happening. There's some movement happening in male participants' trousers. There's like us running into someone in a coffee shop. Like all these things are the kind of like unexpected trigger moments. But then we have to do something with it. We have to connect the dots to something that's meaningful. We have to do something. But also a lot of times it requires tenacity, right? Imagine that moment in the coffee shop. If that person could be your person, like that you fall in love with, it's not just about having that brief conversation. It's about following up. It's about then having that kind of conversation over time, right? And so if you look at serendipity, up to 50% of inventions and innovations are about serendipity. Like, when you look back on your life, you will see that in your CV, a lot of times there was this coincidence, right? But when you look to it, you will see that a lot of times it was about how you acted in a particular situation, how you did something with it, and then also how you had the sagacity or the tenacity to actually go through with it. And so it is not just about this passive moment, but it's about a process of spotting something and then connecting the dots. And so that's what makes it exciting, because we realize, oh, wow, we're missing this all the time. We might not see the trigger, or we might not connect the dots, or we might just not have the tenacity to actually go through with something. And so I want to give you an example. In the broader realm of luck, how much it depends on how we frame the world, how lucky we are. So essentially, there's this example. Maybe let's briefly, can briefly everyone please put in the chat, do you consider yourself to be a lucky person or an unlucky person? Just put like lucky or unlucky. Like, can you put lucky, both?
I just want to highlight that, I'm sorry, I just want to highlight that I don't have a chat option because of the privacy rights of the company.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay.
Yeah. But I consider myself lucky.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Samir. And whenever you have a comment or something, please feel free to just tell us then. That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't consider that. So that's whoever doesn't have a chat function, please tell us. And yeah, Samir, thank you. I appreciate that. So interesting. So both. So we have lucky people and we have both. That's interesting, right? So sometimes lucky, sometimes unlucky. So I want to tell you about an experiment that tells you why I'm asking you this question. And so essentially, there's a researcher in the UK, and he identified people who self-identify as very lucky. So people who say, good things always happen to me, good things, yada, yada. And then people who consider themselves to be very unlucky. So people who say, I'm very, bad things happen to me, I'm always in accidents, all this kind of things. And we both know people, that are both, right? We know people who are a bit luckier than others, and those people who just seem to always have bad things always happen to them. And so then they essentially say to them, you know what, walk down the street, go into the coffee shop, order a coffee and sit down, and then we'll have an interview, then we'll have a conversation. What they don't tell them is that there's a £5 note, so money, in front of the coffee shop door, And inside the coffee shop, the one chair that's free and empty is next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big dreams happen. Now, there's also hidden cameras across the street and in the coffee shop. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside the coffee shop, orders the coffee, and sits down next to the businessman, has a conversation, they exchange business cards, potentially an opportunity coming out of it, we don't know that part. Now, the unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the £5 note, so doesn't see it, goes inside, orders the coffee, sits down next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, and that's that. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, hey, how was your day today? So the lucky person says, it was amazing. I found money in the street. I made a new friend. And, potential opportunity coming out of this, we don't know this. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And so the fascinating thing here is that both faced exactly the same situation. It's not that one had more than the other or something, but both faced exactly the same situation. But depending on how they framed the world, that actually was almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's a lot of experiments along this that show us that how the way we frame the world essentially is a lot about how the world then actually starts to unveil. And so we will talk later, we can talk more about, for example, that the actual talking with the businessman is a bit about like being a bit more extroverted, for example, right? So that can help in some situations to actually allow for conversations and other things to happen. But there's a huge role for introverts as well, right? So to see the money in the street or to see something in the book that you relate to, a podcast idea or something, this is all about calm sources. It's about silent sources. It has nothing to do with extroversion. So there's a lot of introversion also that has to do with serendipity. Now, the problem is we have a lot of biases in our lives, right? A lot of things that hold us back from having actually more serendipity happen in our lives. One of the biggest ones, those of you who are mathematically inclined, I suggest or I recommend to check out the birthday paradox. So the birthday paradox is about, let me ask you a question. And now you shouldn't Google it first, but first answer the question, which is like, what do you think is the probability that two people in this room, let's say it's 23 people, like what do you think is the probability that two people in this room have the same birthday? Like who's good at mathematics? Like what would you do? Like is it 2%, 3%, 5%? Like what is it? 0.1%? So the point is, right, sorry, 0.1, so 10%. Like, so the point is like, it's a very, like, we would usually assume it's a very low probability, right? That two people in this room have the same birthday because it's 365 days in the year, right? And you have 23 people, so you divide that by each other and you have an extremely low probability, right? Now, what would you say if I told you that the probability of two people in a room of 23 people having the same birthday, two people, is 50%? 50%. In a room of like 80 and more people, it's almost 100%. It's almost sure, like it's essentially sure that two people in a room of 100 people have the same birthday. I usually have classes, Muneeb, you might remember this, like at LC, for example, we had a lot of classes of like 60, 70 people, right? In a room of 60 or 70 people, you have a lot of like times where you have 5 or 6 birthday pairs in the room. It's crazy. It's unbelievable, right? But that is the birthday paradox. And the birthday paradox is all about that idea that usually when we think about life and when we think about things, we think linearly, right? We think in terms of let's divide 23 and 365. Let me make a plan and think I know everything. But you know what? There's so many potential things that could happen that it's impossible to predict. There's so many things. You know, the birthday paradox tells us it's exponential. It's not linear. Life is not linear. Life is exponential. So if you have 23 people in a room, let's say Samar has now 22 people who could have the same birthday than her, right? Now, Muneeb still has 21 people who could have the same birthday. Now, Siddhartha still has 20 people who could have the same birthday. Samia then has still 19 people. So the point is it's an exponential function rather than a linear function. And that is something, you know, as someone who like, I didn't used to be good in maths when I was younger. And, you know, it took me a while to actually get into this, but it's fascinating because it tells us mathematically why the unexpected happens all the time, even if we don't always see it, and how highly likely it is that something unexpected happens. You know, it's very unlikely that my erratic hand movements push this laptop down so that the presentation stops. It's very unlikely that Samar starts shouting at me and says, Christian, you should stop now. It's very unlikely that Muneeb cuts the Zoom connection. All of these things are extremely unlikely, right? But if you add up all these potentially unlikely things, it becomes quite likely that something unexpected might happen. And you know, when you go to conferences and you see a glitch happen, you always think, oh my God, like, didn't they plan for this? Like, what amateurs? Like, shouldn't they be more professional? You're right. But there's just so many potential things that could go wrong or right that you can't predict everything. And so the point here is, long story short, that we continuously underestimate how often the unexpected happens, because either we don't see it because we don't expect it, or we don't open our eyes to it, like this guy, right? When you don't see the £5 note because you don't expect it, you don't expect anything, then you won't see it. So the long story short is, a big bias we have is that we underestimate the unexpected, so we miss it all the time. Another bias, and one of my favorites, is actually the idea that we tend to post-rationalize everything, right? So we make a certain plan, and then life happens, and it's more like a squiggle than a linear line, right? And then we still tell it again as if it's like, just like, and then I wanted this, and then I wanted this job and did this, right? Imagine the situation where you present your CV to a new employer. You wouldn't say, I randomly ran into this person, then randomly this. You would say, no, I always wanted to go into this area, and then I wanted to do this, and then this. So you make it seem as if you always had control, but actually it's just an illusion of control, right? The point is, we tend to constantly airbrush serendipity out of our stories because we have this illusion of control, even though it does happen all the time. Now, we'll get back to that later on when we speak, and also I think in the conversation later with Muneeb, we'll probably touch on a couple of those things. We can also talk about how the perception of serendipity might change over time. I'd love to, actually, maybe I'll briefly tell you now before we dive into practices, and then we'll have the conversation. But I want to really kind of highlight that idea that the perception of serendipity might change over time, right? Because we essentially, I will not forget, when I handed in the book to the publisher, the first draft, they were like, hey, look, we really like the book. We love the stories, but we need more love stories. And, you know, I, as a then 35-year-old guy, like, I was like, look, like, what do I know as a then 35-year-old single guy? Like, what do I know about love stories? What do I know about love? Like, what should I give you? And they were like, no, but find some love stories. So I was like, okay, let me see. Now, right after that, I had a meeting with an ex-girlfriend of mine who kind of like, I asked her, hey, like, how, you know, I need more love stories. Tell me about some love stories. And she was like, well, our story. And I was like, what do you mean our story? Like, we're not together anymore. Where's the love here? Like, where's the success here? Like, where's the positive outcome? She was like, look, like, we met at a time in our lives where we both were kind of looking for something. We met serendipitously in the Starbucks. We helped each other emotionally, and in other ways we introduced each other to the right people. So in a way, we beautifully shaped a beautiful friendship and a beautiful thing for each other. And even if we're not together anymore, it was a very positive outcome for both of us, the life that we lived because of that. And so it dawned on me, wow, like, it made me question, what is actually a positive outcome, right? In general, is it just like, for a relationship, it is that you're together or not together, or is it other things? Same in business or other things, but also it depends on when we look at it, right? In the moment of the breakup, it felt like shit, but then over time it was like, oh, actually, it was probably the best thing that could have happened. So really, this idea that perception of serendipity can change over time. We should never stop the story at the bad ending, right? There's this beautiful saying John Lennon and others have, that essentially a happy ending depends on when you stop the story, right? If you stop the story too early, that's not good. And so that's the tenacity part, right? We need to go through to have a happy ending in the end. So before I dive into the practices, I just want to give a brief caveat that, of course, there's always structural constraints, right? The starting level of serendipity for me here in the West Village in New York, having access to networks and education, I'm at a much higher potential base level of serendipity than the kid in the Cape Flats in Cape Town, or in Kenya, who doesn't have access to education or networks. So we start at very different starting positions. And so at the same time as we're working on the mindset question, of course, we also have to work on like removing these constraints that hold people back from having more serendipity in their lives. And so I'm a big fan of also working on those questions. Now, wrapping up a couple of practices that we can all use in our lives. One is, I'm a big fan of the hook strategy. The hook strategy is about this idea that You know, this dreaded question when someone asks you at a conference, so what do you do, right? And it puts you into a box that kind of like is very different to get out of. But there's this amazing entrepreneur in London called Ollie Barrett. And if you would ask him something like, what do you do? He would say something like, I'm a technology entrepreneur, but recently started reading into the philosophy of science. But what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. I recently started hosting piano matinees. You should come by. Oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister is teaching the philosophy of science. You should come in as a guest speaker. The point here is we can use every conversation, every interaction to see the couple of dots, to cast a couple of hooks that the other person could connect for us. And that is how serendipity happens a lot, right? It's not only us connecting dots, it's us giving others the opportunity to connect dots for us. And that's really about us thinking. I'm a big fan, for example, making a serendipity journal and writing down what are the key areas you're interested in, and how can you seed a little bit of this into every conversation, even into routine conversations? Can you just say a side sentence like, oh my God, I just came from XYZ conversation, it was really interesting, and then you move on, but you can see if that kind of hook somehow did something with the other person or not. And so you can build in these different types of hooks into every conversation. We talked about the idea that we can look at mistakes and crises differently. There's a couple of interesting practices. We can talk about this later, especially, for example, around project funerals and post-mortems, which are all about this idea that usually, you know, we try to hide ideas away, but actually, you know, we should celebrate the things that didn't work and the learning that comes from it. And so project funerals are about this idea that when a project and idea doesn't work, instead of then hiding it away and not learning from each other, it's about presenting it, laying it to rest and saying, this is what we learned from it. And so if you're a project manager in one division and you lay that to rest, you invite people from other divisions and you say, this is what we learned from it. And so in this one example of a company I worked with, they have this window glass. And you know, the idea is it's an amazing technology where the light doesn't reflect, but they realize the market is not big enough for that. And so what they did was to say, okay, we lay this to rest. We learned that next time we want to understand the market better. Now, someone in the audience goes like, hey, have you considered what this would mean for solar? Have you considered if we would take that technology into a solar context, how much energy that could absorb? And that is how coincidentally their solar division emerged. Now, and that's how a lot of times serendipity then happens, right? By definition, we can't know what exactly the outcome will be, but it's those kind of coincidental moments that we help create by developing rituals and by developing different ways of how we can go about it. We can talk more about other examples. For now, I want to kind of dive into, you know, wrapping up on a philosophical note and then diving into the conversation with Samar and Muneeb. All of this work is really motivated by a much bigger philosophical kind of question and point. Goethe, you know, I grew up in Heidelberg where Goethe wrote a lot of poems, and he had this beautiful idea that if we take someone as they are, we make them worse, but if we take someone as who they could be, you make them capable of becoming who they can be. And that is what serendipity is about. Serendipity is about seeing more in a situation than there is, seeing more in a person. Like you look at a former drug addict and you see a potential teacher. You look at an old garage and you see a training center. And that is how you can like then start seeing the potentiality of potential serendipity, because you open your eyes to it, but also you give that kind of idea of what could be. And so the philosophical notion really is that kind of deeper line behind this. For now, thank you so much for being here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Christian. I think one of the comments that came through, Fatma is saying, this is so eye-opening. I completely agree. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to request the audience, if they have any questions, comments, suggestions, whatever, they can start, either use the chat function. If you also want to go unmute and ask your questions, that would be wonderful. I do know that there are a few questions that Muneeb and I had you know, discussed that we would put to Christian. So if there are any questions, it would be wonderful if people can type them out. And Muneeb, over to you. Why don't you start off with question number 1 in the meantime?
Yeah, so I think, Christian, one of the questions that I kind of, you know, was really kind of thinking about was within the context of you know, what are some of the biggest problems you see as barriers towards cultivating serendipity, especially in resource-constrained environments, which tend to be very, you know, kind of very unadaptive towards exploring new ideas. The status quo dominates over there, because that's kind of one of the problems that I've had initially. I've kind of gotten a lot better at it now. But, you know, when you're in the government, for instance, which is the worst bureaucratic Kafkaesque sort of a department, how do you kind of try and change people's mindsets towards that?
That's a great question. And I think there's kind of, I guess, 3 points to that. The first one is around that resistance to change. I mean, serendipity a lot of times is about change, right? It's about something that is different from what we expected or what others expected. And so it can be frightening, right? Because things that are uncertain can be frightening. And so there I felt, rather than having like one big thing that like is being thrown at people, it's about like small behavioral changes, small nudges where, you know, for example, a colleague of mine at LZ, right? He's the kind of person who would be like, Christian, serendipity sounds great, but like I live an okay life. I don't need serendipity in my life. And so there's no way that we could convince him, like saying, oh my God, no, but like, see how it changes everything. Like he wouldn't even like be open to it. But then we made a deal. We said, you know what? Try 2 small exercises. Like next time you speak with the next 5 people you speak, just like build in 2 or 3 like side sentences about like a new interest you have and like see what happens. Or like when you speak with a barista in the coffee shop, just ask them slightly different questions about, you know, what they are most interested in, what they are working on as a side project, whatever it is. And then think about how that connects to the people in your life and how you could connect that to them. Could you introduce them? And, you know, this guy comes back to me after a couple of weeks and he's like, my God, Christian, I didn't know that life can be so joyful. I didn't even know what's out there because I never did that. And so it's those kind of behavioral changes that we can bring in. And I think that's something where I think also, I assume you've been trying that with serendipity bombs and other things, right? Where you're essentially saying, let's do small things that then essentially show people in a small way how it works. And then they get excited and then they want more and more and more.
Yeah, I think I found this Wittgensteinian quote. What is the point of philosophy, or what is the point to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle? And I think you really you can't just go like fly, get out of the bottle, or you can't just say serendipity and expect people to do that. It's little changes that, as you said. So I'm glad I'm kind of, you know, through trial and error on the same track.
Okay, so I had a question, Christian, regarding you know, when you mentioned your car accident. And you talked about how that was a defining moment. And often at times it is like that. There is something which shakes us up. And suddenly we turn over a new leaf, or we decide to do things in a different way. In your case, it obviously had an impact on you as well. But then oftentimes we go back to our original ways, right? To habits. So how do you cultivate that? So, you know, how do you sustain such profound moments for a longer period of time?
Yeah. You know, that's a great one, because I feel so something that I feel is very useful is doing a serendipity journal, where you say, okay, what is kind of a sense of direction or a certain North Star, just something that I feel my life should be about for this next year, or something like a compass, right? So in my case, for example, at the moment, it's a lot about saying, you know, there is the book and there is so much content that I deeply believe in. So I want to integrate that into different curricula. I want to make sure that like everyone is exposed to that kind of mindset. And so every conversation I have, then what I try to do is I try to seed that in as a side sentence. So like, oh my God, yeah, I'm so sorry. I just came from expert conversation about how serendipity this and this, but now we can focus on our thing. And so essentially what I'm trying to do is to identify this kind of core theme or core interest, and then like use every conversation. And so rather than having to force ourselves in a way to artificially build in a new routine or something, it's more about building it into the things that we're anyways doing. And because we're doing it, then it happens all the time. And so in this case, for example, the car accident, yes, was the big trigger point, but I think it set me up to kind of then figure out, okay, what is it that I feel is meaningful to me? And then how can I create different things around this, different, you know, what are the kind of people, the kind of institutions that help me do that? But I think one thing that I did, for example, pragmatically, was to say, okay, every conversation I have, I want to think about at least one thing that I can do to connect something. So when someone tells me we have a conversation, I think about who can I introduce them to? What's an idea that I could bring in so that might help them in their project? Like just kind of like in this thing. And so at the beginning, it's a bit like you have to force yourself to do that, but then it comes naturally at some point. You don't even have to think about it anymore. And so it comes back also to Muneeb's point earlier. Like, I think the more we can, in a way, build behaviors into our day-to-day that become natural, the more it's not about us just having like a thought and then getting back into our usual routines, because we reframed our usual routines towards where we want to go.
Okay, I think that makes a lot of sense. There's some conversation. I know Siddhartha had a question as well. Yes, go ahead, Siddhartha.
Hey, hi. Christian, it's not a question. I just wanted to just share something that I'm so glad that that image on your book is so good, because it sort of reflects what I've experienced in my life. So I was a biology student, then became a chef, and then worked with an airlines company. And from there, I worked with a $1 trillion bank, left it, did my MBA, and got back to IT for the past 10 years, and now lead a artificial intelligence company. So it's got absolutely nothing to do with what I started off, but that linkage, what you are talking about, one thing leading to another thing, I thought it was theoretically not possible. And I mean, what's the chance of actually having a book and an author that I'm actually talking to today, right? So it's really cool. Thanks a lot, and it's nice having you here.
Yeah,
thank you so much, Siddhartha, for sharing, and thank you for this, because I feel, Siddhartha, you're, I think, beautifully putting into words what life partly is about, right? This question of like, there might be an invisible theme that is behind, right? So like, I would be curious actually to hear what it is in your case, right? Like almost like a driving force. Maybe it is about kind of mixing ideas or people or whatever it is, but exactly, it can then manifest in so many different ways, right? It can manifest in something that looks very different on the CV, and people would be like, oh, you got distracted here. No, I didn't. Like, it was all like a theme, and at hindsight, you can connect the dots and you can say, oh my God, it all makes sense. I mean, do you feel in your case there was something that brings it together in some way, or is it kind of, how did you decide?
No, I actually had absolutely no plan as in to land up in artificial intelligence 18 years ago when I started my studies, right? I mean, the most complicated computer was just a Pentium, which doesn't even exist today, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think the principles of biology that I've actually learned about 17, 18 years ago, right, are practically the mathematical equations of today's AI. I mean, who knew that, you know, and today I work with the world's most leading cognitive AI for enterprises, right? And there are 35 engineers, and I'm the only one engineer who's actually leading them. So it is so strange that I could possibly understand the concepts without knowing what those concepts are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So probably if I wouldn't have understood biology that well and fundamentals of physics and chemistry during then, maybe I wouldn't. I don't even know programming for that matter. So it's serendipity is what you call it. Then maybe that's the name.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing, Siddhartha. Okay, so Shavi is asking if you could elaborate a little bit more on the Serendipity Journal. Christian.
Yes, yeah, thank you, sorry. And maybe just as last note also on Siddhartha's point, I think that's a beautiful one, right? Because if you think about everything from like, I mean, even Steve Jobs, right? How he came up with all these kind of things like mouse or his like, you know, the fonts in like his Apple products. He took a random calligraphy class in university, and he didn't even know what he would ever need it for. And then at some point he connected the dots and said, my God, I can build a computer that actually makes use of this. But like that, you know, so it's exactly that. And Siddhartha made a beautiful case, I think, of like, it's really our ability to then kind of use like things that we saw in the past and then connect it to something that's relevant now. And again, like, there's usually kind of an underlying force then, being it a deep curiosity or being it enjoying something that kind of, whatever the kind of underlying theme is. But I think this idea that a lot of times serendipity comes out of something that we didn't even know would have any meaning 20 years ago. And then at some point we connect the dots, we see something in the window and we have a new podcast now because we connected dot to something we saw in our childhood, right? So it's really these kind of moments which come then. And so, yeah, so the question of the Serendipity Journal, I think it's like really this idea to say, okay, like let me reflect on how can I have more serendipity in my life. And like the first step really is to say, what is, like, if serendipity is all about connecting the dots, the question always is, what do I want to connect the dots to, right? It's like sometimes we just kind of randomly like have like a thunderbolt moment and like something completely new comes. But a lot of times we might have like a certain North Star or sense of direction, like in this case, for example, bringing serendipity into curriculum. And so the Serendipity Journal as a first step says, let me identify what are the core themes or North Stars that could be interesting, so that next time I speak with people, I could try to connect a little bit to those kind of different things and set hooks in that direction, connect dots towards this and so on. Now, another step also is really going deeper and saying, when I reflect on my life, what were the moments that were unexpected, where either I acted on them and something beautiful happens and I'm grateful and I can learn from what it was about those moments and can have more of those moments. But also, what were those unexpected moments where I didn't act on it? What were those coffee shop moments or so where I felt there could be something, but something held me back? And then really going deeper and asking, what is it that really holds me back here? What is the self-limiting belief? What is is it imposter syndrome? Is it that people like me are not supposed to X, Y, Z? And really working on these deeper underlying psychological barriers. And I think, to me, one thing I've realized is, like, one of the beauties of writing this book was, I'm a big fan of, very practical exercises. And I think there's a lot of exercises we can do to have more serendipity. And at the same time, really realizing that it really starts with very deep work also in our own psychology, because we might see a lot of opportunities out there, but we might not act on them because we might not feel worthy or ready or anything else. And so it's really also working on that deeper psychology. And I had this wonderful interaction a couple of years ago with a wonderful person in London. And I asked him, so how much serendipity do you have in your life? And he said, before I was 25, never, and after 25, all the time. And so I asked him, like, what changed? And he said, look, I came out of a working class family where, like, the one thing my parents always told me was, people like us, like, we are not the kind of people who get rich. We're not the kind of people who go to university. We're not the kind of people, da, 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 da. And so he essentially worked as a waiter at that time. And people would always say, my God, you have great energy. Like, you're a fantastic person. You're smart. I want to connect you with this person. Maybe they could help you out with a job or something. And he would always say, no. Like, I'm okay. Like, I'm okay here. And so then at some point he met a couple of, like, new people, a couple of friends who made him feel, oh, wow, I can do much more in my life. Like, why do I not do something? And then he started acting on those kind of opportunities. And then he realized, oh my God, I didn't have to define myself like this. And I feel like I've seen that in my own life in other ways as well, that we have these kind of self-defining, self-limiting beliefs. But actually, once we start, like, not kind of like limiting ourselves like this, we see more opportunities, but also we act differently on them. And the Serendipity Journal is really to say, what is the underlying themes that we really can work on, and then really kind of noting them down each time they happen and really thinking about it and connecting the dots in a way with it.
Okay, so I can see another very important question that's come through from Fatma. With people struggling with anxiety or mental illness of some kind, it is very hard to believe that unexpected things can happen that are good. Most of your mind believes in the negative possibilities. What would be the very first steps to change that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can so relate to it. I mean, I grew up in Germany, we love certainty, we love strategies, we love planning everything out. And then life happens, you're like, oh my God, like that's scary, right? And so I think in that case, it's really in a way that shifts like how to see uncertainty away from a threat to like a potential ally. I think comes a lot of times in trying to reframe a situation. And to give you one example, there's an organization in the Cape Flats in Cape Town called Reconstructed Living Labs. And when they go, like, what they do is like it's low cost education methodologies, like something like 10 steps to use social media to build a company. And so essentially they go into those contexts, and instead of asking, what do you need? Instead of making it about resources, and then, people don't have resources and then getting anxious about resources, they say, what is already here and how can we make the best out of it? There's a former drug dealer, fantastic. That person will have a lot of social capital. That person will be very resourceful. That person, if we can turn them into a teacher, they will turn the whole community around. If we see an old garage, we could make that a training center. And that reframing away from there's a constraint, there's something that can't work, there's something that's bad, to saying there still is probably something in this situation that we could do something with. That framing, essentially, it's those kind of small things we can do in our day-to-day lives where once we start doing this, right? So I don't know, let me give you an example. I had like when I was putting up my laptop thing here, like I put it on a lot of books, right? So that it is as tall as I am. and then it fell down, right? And I was like, oh shit, like, right? And so in those moments, you could just be like, oh my God, shit, like, this is so annoying. But then I just was like, okay, great. Like maybe there's a book now that I should look at, or maybe there's something. And I actually rediscovered like there's an amazing puzzle kind of game thing that was under it, which is all about, right? Like puzzle coming together and connecting dots and everything else. And so that now literally I put on my parking lot in the Serendipity kind of lots that I have, where I was like, okay, like do that puzzle game again and do X, Y, Z. It's a stupid example, but it came to mind because it's that idea of in every situation that goes wrong, or every situation that doesn't really go perfectly, there's still something in there that we can reframe into something positive. And I think by forcing oneself, by really thinking about, okay, how can I, whenever something happens that I'm anxious about, how can I still see something in there that could be okay? By forcing ourselves, we literally reframe like our brain, right? And we reframe the way we look at the world. And that's actually why I enjoy working with psychologists, because there's this whole idea of reframing, how we can like ease anxiety by essentially kind of like reframing situations and doing that. And again, that depends. It's a very individual question. I'm not a psychologist who, you know, would be qualified to, or a therapist who would be qualified to go too deep into the mechanics of it. But what I've seen in my own life and in our research is that the way we reframe the world in a way then allows us to kind of also re-perceive situations differently. And in my case, it has eased my anxieties because essentially I can always see, oh, there could still be something. It doesn't take away the emotional response, right? The emotional response a lot of times might still be like, wow, oh. But actually then logically, I'm like, oh, I've seen this before. Oh, I've handled this before. And I think there's a lot of work, 2 readings I would recommend. One is Adam Grant. He has done some amazing work around resilience, and really this question of how do you, whenever, for example, you're in an anxiety enhancing like state, that you think about what would you tell a friend now if your friend would be in a situation where you just dropped the books and you're like, oh my God, I have to give a talk in 1 minute. Like, what would you tell a friend? You would probably just say, Jesus, just pick up the books and have the talk, right? You wouldn't say like, oh my God, like XYZ might happen. And so it's really these things of like taking perspective, taking ourselves out of the situation, looking at it from the outside and saying, what can I do about it? And that in itself is a bit of reframing. And then the second, so I would like highly recommend Adam Grant's work on resilience. And second, I would highly recommend Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, because it is all about that question of how can you in every situation still find some kind of meaning? So for example, he was in a concentration camp. It's the toughest situation you can imagine in life. Every day you could be killed. There's no real meaning in that situation, right? You just think you're just waiting to be killed like the next day, right? And everyone around you will be killed. So there's no inherent meaning in that situation. But then he says, you know what? I cannot influence this situation, but I can influence my response to it. And the way I can influence the response to it is to say, you know what? I still can tomorrow talk with a fellow prisoner and make them feel a bit better about themselves. And by doing this, I have a meaning now. I have the meaning to take care of this person. And that's during COVID, right? Like where some people took care of their neighbors, that made them feel good about themselves, right? Because that gives you meaning in those periods. And so when it comes to anxiety, I felt that is very effective to really try to understand how can I find meaning in this, but also how can I do something good for someone else, because those are always the kind of things that give us like this grounding again of saying, wow, there's some kind of value in all of this. But long story short, I don't think I have the perfect silver or golden bullet answer to that question, because I think it's very individual to life circumstance. But I think the question of resilience and of finding meaning in crisis, like these are the 2 that come to mind intuitively. But I'd also love to, by the way, if people in the audience, I mean, I'm sure you have, lived through very like interesting life experiences, or you've had really interesting serendipity moments in your life, sort of thing. So I'd also love to hear from you, like if there's anything you would recommend us to do, or anything where you feel like that's the one thing that you do always, and it always leads to serendipity or to decreasing anxiety. I mean, please do let us know also.
I've mentioned in chat as well, it would be wonderful to hear your stories. I'm willing to offer an anecdote. So I met this person a few years back at a conference. He'd reached out because I was working for a financial inclusion organization at the time, and he'd seen I was going to be there, etc. Somehow or the other, he made the connect. I am not really in touch with that person, but he introduced me to somebody who is one of my best friends. And she is also an advisor for Epiphany, right? And we've only met once in person, but we have a very, very good relationship. So it was a fluke. He said, oh, you should meet Naira. She's also from Pakistan. You're also from Pakistan. So literally his thing was, you should meet because both of you like to talk a lot and you're both from Pakistan. And that was his intro. And, surprisingly, we're still the best of friends. So anybody who wants to offer their, serendipitous, I can't say the word, but that's the word. You know the word that I'm looking for. If you would like to share that moment, that would be wonderful. Also, coming back to Fatma. So Fatma, it depends really what works for you and for other people. Sometimes it just helps to sleep it off, right? So some days it's a bad day, and I'm a morning person, so I just kind of look for the morning light, and I kind of want to just sleep it off. Being close to nature helps. Listening to white music helps. There are multiple things that different people will try. So just do something which works for you, I guess, right? So, okay. So questions from the audience. And while we're waiting for those, Muneeb, I know you have a question.
Yeah. So I think one of the things, not just at an individual level, but one of the things that Christian mentioned earlier is that a lot of the times we don't take that first step. We don't try. And I think a lot of the times, and in my experience at least, when you try so many times that you keep on failing, failure just becomes just another thing, right? I think there's a sort of a curve, and eventually when you fail enough times, when enough people don't reply to your messages, it just becomes a part of daily reality. The good thing about that though is I know you know that, Christian. I was one of the startup mentors on the LSE Lean Accelerator program. There were 30 of us chosen to kind of mentor a lot of different startups, and so David who's the head of innovation these days at the LSE, he actually gave an Excel sheet with all the names of all the mentors, and I literally added all of them, all the mentors, and I sent that serendipity line, a bit of like, oh, let's cultivate. I'm willing to cultivate serendipity. Only one person replied back to me. That person he's one of my best friends now. His name is Chandler Wilson, and he actually happens to be one of the world's pioneers when it comes to machine learning. He was the global head of data science innovation at the HSBC. He built their infrastructure from the ground up. So had I not been willing to take those 28 failures, after the second one, no one's going to reply back to me. I think one of the most important things is to keep on persisting. Don't let failure define you is one piece of advice that I kind of like to add to that. What is your opinion on that, Christian? Because in low resource countries like Pakistan, people try a lot of different things for one reason or the other. It doesn't work out. How would you kind of advise them to persist in the face of difficulties?
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, I completely agree, right? That a lot of times in life, it's a numbers game, right? It's a numbers game in the sense of the more shots you take on something, the more likely it is that something works out, right? And I mean, a friend of mine recently just told me about exactly like that serendipity bomb approach that he used, right? He set up a new MBA program, and he just reached out to all the key company people on LinkedIn that could potentially be interested in, and he just did that 200 times, right? And he was just like, yeah, it's a given that 195 of them will say whatever. And then 5 people were like, great, let's do it. And so the point here is it's all a numbers game in that sense of like increasing the numbers of this. But also I think to your point, there's the deeper psychological idea that to be less afraid of rejection, right? Because in a way, and I remember a teacher actually when I was in school, and it was a bit of a kind of he was a bit of criticized about his methods, and I'm still slightly ambiguous about it, but when I think about it, it actually helped us a lot. So what he did was he told us, you will, for the next days, go to in the train station, you have these train ticket machines, and you will go there each time without money. And each time you will ask the person there to say, I'm so sorry, I forgot my wallet. Would you mind giving me enough money for this ticket? And so essentially what you're doing here is you're setting yourself up for a lot of rejection constantly, right? People consistently saying, oh, like, are you begging? Oh, are you doing this? Oh, are you doing this? but you're learning to get okay with that kind of rejection. And at some point you see it more as a kind of like, oh, okay, now it's a challenge. Now the challenge is like, can I charm them into this? Can I get them into the, and you then learn how to actually do it in a way that people don't feel threatened about it, but you actually say, hey, look, like, this and this. And so the point here is, the reason we were ambivalent about it is because I think there's a whole question around, you know, how ethical those kind of questions are. But I think in general, that idea of how do you essentially learn to get okay with rejection, I think that's an important one. And so, you know, a friend of mine, Joe Colombano, he was running the SDG directorate at the United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he got his first job in the World Bank was he took the book of the World Bank, like back in the days they didn't have like internet pages for people. He took the book and he just called everyone in that book and he just said, hey, I'm Joe. I wanted to ask if you have a job for someone who's excited and who could do things. And he just called through the whole book. And at some point someone was like, you know what, you got balls. Like I want to talk with you. And then that's how he got his first job. The point here is it's exactly that kind of idea that we just got to get comfortable at putting a lot of shots out there and overcoming this. It's not easy. It's not easy, but it gets easier over time, right?
You know, for a certain time in my life, I had to be a fundraiser, right? So I was the head of resource mobilization. And that's the first thing that you learn. That you've got to go through, if you've applied 100 times, one proposal may be successful, and that too if you're lucky. But you have to just keep doing it. And you have to cultivate relationships with the most obnoxious people who may have shut the door the first time around, but you have to cultivate a relationship. So eventually, they may actually become your donors. So I know that Siddhartha just unmuted. So did you want to say something?
Yeah, early days of my life. So in my career as well, right? So I was a sales guy. So that's how you get an entry into technology, right? So you'll have to sell it before you start leading it, right? So roughly about 180 times, you know, I got no before I got my first sale. And today, that lady based out of Australia, right? She suffered a major accident, and then, you know, she started her own company, and the name of the product of that company happens to be an Indian origin, and she wanted to distribute it through me today. So talk about rejection, right? So after a certain point of time, it's just a result. There is no emotion attached to it. So it's either a binary, it's 1 and 0. That's it. If you can see that in that way, I felt it's a lot more useful, right? It's just a result.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? And then also, like, even building on this, that in every rejection, there still might be a lot in there, right? There might be a lot of learning in there. That's the reframing piece, right? There might be a lot of learning in there. There might be a lot of kind of, this whole theme around how I know a lot of people who got rejected from a job, but kept in touch with the person who rejected them. And they later set up a business together, or they do something else, because the rejection was for that particular moment, for a particular reason. But it doesn't mean that they rejected you as a person, or they didn't, you know what I mean? So I think it's exactly those kind of themes, right?
Not for the relationship.
Exactly.
So I know that we asked you to block 1 hour of your time, and it's been a little more than that. So Christian, thank you so very much for being here. I'm just wondering if you can finish off by telling us about some key attributes which people should try to cultivate to take advantage of serendipity, and then we will let you go.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like the biggest one that I had to learn is to learn to be okay with the idea that you can have a sense of direction and a plan, but also to have the humility to constantly adjust based on realities, and to not see it as imperfection, to not see it as something that goes wrong, but to actually see it as part of the plan, to see it as a great mindset to be able to do that, but also in a company, for example, as a great capability to say, we have a plan here, we have a strategy, but also if we see farmers calling up who say they need a potato washing machine, or if we see that there's some movement in male participants' trousers, to be ready for that unexpectedness and do something with it, and not see it as a weakness, but actually see it as part of a healthy corporate culture, part of a healthy system. And so it's really, I think, a key takeaway is, in a way, like letting go of this illusion of control, letting go of the idea that we can control everything, and really going to the idea of how do we set ourselves up, how do we build a muscle for the unexpected, that whatever life throws at us, we cannot always control the situation, but we can control our response to it. And I think that's really kind of what the key theme around this would be. And I think there's a lot of kind of strategies and exercises and so on. I'm also, by the way, delighted to keep in touch. Please feel free to reach out on Twitter, Chris Serendip, or on LinkedIn, or else I'd be delighted to keep in touch. It seems like this is a wonderful group full of people who have or want to have more serendipity. So yeah, delighted to keep in touch. And thank you so much, Samar and Muneeb, for making it possible and bringing it together. Hopefully at some point in person as well.
Yeah, no, Christian, thank you so much. Yeah, you know, I think you actually delivered my commencement address, and you know, to kind of have that, you know, when you kind of look at someone delivering a commencement address, there's a kind of, I think you kind of say it really well when you said everyone's kind of faking it until you make it. And I watched that commencement address earlier today, and you started that commencement address, and I kind of saw that little moment when you were like, oh, I hope that baby is crying out of excitement, and you could tell that you aren't quite sure. But you know, you kind of caught yourself. So yeah, you know, it's absolutely amazing to have you here today, and thank you so much for your time. Samar?
Yes, thanks so much, Christian, and thank you so very much, everybody else, for joining in.
Yeah, and thank you so much, and thank you so much, Muneeb, for all the positive energy. I think that's amazing, and Samar for you know, connecting those dots with us. So yeah, great to be here, and thank you so much.
Awesome. So much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great evening. Have a great day, Christian.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.